So anyway, Lawrence, let's talk about England. What you're about to witness is not ITV's coverage of the Six Nations 2025. We are going to talk about England for half an hour though, so I do understand why you might be confused and think that's what you've tuned into.
England aren't very good, mate. Nah, they're not as good as when I was coaching them, mate.
So, we have a fascinating England team. I think this is a rare occurrence in that I think England are the most interesting side in this year's Six Nations. They're the team I'm most excited to watch. Not in the same way you get excited to watch, like, you know, an All Blacks or France, you know, are nominally, like, objectively the team you're most excited to watch. But England, I think, are the most interesting because it's hardest to tell where they are. But I also think they're the team with the highest ceiling, like, highest distance between where they are now and their ceiling.
Yeah, and they've clearly got a coaching staff who are able to get the best of that out of them. You know, we've discussed this off air before, but I've come to terms with the fact that this is probably the most I will ever like the English national rugby team at the moment. And I think they're great to watch. People are really harsh on them, I think, because they've had so many very near results in the autumn, which has mainly come from a few glitches in their defence, I think, was the main kind of catalyst of that, which we will get onto. And I think that autumn campaign was best summed up by Marcus Smith when he was interviewed by TNT at the end of the campaign. And they kind of said, well, everybody's putting fire on the defence, on your kicking tactics, on your selection and so on. What do you think is the issue? And Marcus Smith just said, well, we want to still do this hammer defence because I've trained against it. I know how hard it is to attack against. We still want to do this aggressive blitz defence. We just need to do it better. Yeah. And that is the situation England find themselves in, is that they are still relatively close to the start of a World Cup cycle and they are trying maybe the most ambitious style of defence that there is to possibly do. And they previously had it where Eddie Jones was trying to do the most ambitious style of attack there is to do. They got rid of him. They started from scratch. And this is where they find themselves. It's better that they're doing this 3 years out from a World Cup, or 2 years out from a World Cup now, rather, than doing it 6 months out from a World Cup, you know? And I think that England fans should actually be optimistic about that.
Yeah, and I think this England team feel to me, and there may be people that listen to this having listened to my preview on, you know, with Ben Youngs and Dan Cole on For the Love of Rugby. Well, I'm about to say some of the same points, so I apologise for anyone listening to both. But
I've not heard that yet because it's not out yet.
It will be by the time this comes out.
Yeah, but not at the time of recording.
England team remind me a little bit of South Africa in 2018, that first year under Radhi Erasmus, right? Where they'd gone from that Springbok team who had a few really good games under Alex Coetzee and a few games where you could see that attack clicking and things he was building clicking and things really working. But broadly, they would have games where they were terrible and they weren't in games at all. They would have games where they were so focused on the attack that the defence just like let slip things. They would have games where their tactics were completely off and wrong. And then in comes Radhi Erasmus and suddenly he just gets them into a place where they're competitive in every single game, right? Yeah. And you look at the 5 best teams in the world at that time. South Africa were probably 5th, but the top 4 were New Zealand, you had Ireland, you had Wales, and you had then England, right? And in that first year under Radhi Erasmus, South Africa played those other 4 sides, the other 4 best sides in the world, 7 times. They won 3 of them, right? England played the other top 4 sides in the world at the minute, so you're looking at New Zealand, South Africa, Ireland, and France. They played them 8 times last year, and they only won 1 of them. But you then go, well, there's 2 games against the All Blacks that easily could have gone the other way. There was a drop goal from George Ford in that 1 game against the All Blacks that slid one side of the post to the other. And then one where they were leading against France with 2 minutes to go, and then Ramos kicks a penalty from in his own half, right? You can easily take that kick from Ramos going just under the bar and that drop goal by Marcus Smith going just left, and you've got the identical set of results, right? Because like those South Africa wins came largely in late results in those big games, like the Damien McKenzie not taking the drop goal in the pocket and things like that. What Borthwick has done is build a team that's in the fight in the final 5 minutes of every game. And even the South African, which was the one game they did lose by like a significant margin, they were in the fight of 10, 15 minutes to go.
And they were disappointed to lose it.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, you know, like that Ramos penalty didn't dip under the bar. Yeah. It did go over, you know, and so on. But you're right, like there's such a parallel between that and, as you say, that Razzie team. And it sounds mental when I say this, but like, they are one of the teams I would feel more comfortable about. They have something that you can clearly see they're trying to build ahead of a World Cup, you know, and they've got such a long time to prepare that. And they are one of the teams that if I was a fan of them, I would feel more comfortable with going into World Cup year in 2 years' time.
My current hottest rugby take, right, if you're ready for this, is I think there's a greater chance of this England team going on to win the 2027 World Cup than this Ireland team. I think this Ireland team, we'll get onto them in another episode of this, are pretty much at their ceiling and they're just maintaining that level. This England team, I think, are miles from their ceiling and they've been getting steadily better. And people are going, well, why aren't you up here? Why haven't you jumped up here? And actually, you've got to go, well, the growth of this team is steady, but I think it's much more, it's much easier to maintain and it's much like deliberately steady than what Eddie Jones was doing in the second half of his reign, which is he was trying to build something that could be absolutely world-beating and dominant, but he was doing it at the cost of other parts of their game. And they didn't like that. And what Borthwick's doing is slightly more conservative in that he's gone, okay, well, first we're going to be incredibly competitive against everyone. No one is going to beat us by miles. Everyone that plays us will have a really tough time. And then slowly, we'll start to turn that from 1 or 2 wins a year into 3 or 4 wins a year into, 6 or 7 wins a year. And you can never count on 8 against the best sides in the world. International rugby is so competitive at the minute. So if you can get to the point where you're winning 6 or 7 of 8 games against the top sides in the world in a year,
it's not a bad place to be in.
That's not a bad place to be.
Of course, the natural response to your theory there is how close is England's ceiling to Ireland's ceiling? Who's got the higher one of those and by what distance? And the thing is, in theory, the answer to that question should be England. Because Ireland are maybe the most innovative attacking team in world rugby at the moment. And yet, when one team's innovative, everybody else in international rugby just copies them. Yeah. It's just the way it works. Yeah. Not just with attack, but with defence, with kicking, with set piece to a degree, absolutely everything. Just if you've got the resources, you've got players who are good enough, you copy them. International tier 1 level, most teams do, right? England also, of course, have the most resources in terms of players, and you can't say that they don't have a couple of the bullshit players, to use a technical term within the confines of this channel, because they do have world-class players. And sometimes you've got to kind of count on luck a little bit that you have some of those.
They have the 3rd most professional players in the world and the 2nd most professional teams in the world, which is critical when giving those players opportunities. However, in terms of resources, they also have the resources to basically buy in any assistant coach they want. Yeah. Which helps enormously in getting...
Of course, we're simplifying this massively, but yeah.
Yeah. But I think then this England squad do have the potential beyond where Ireland are. Yeah. Because you can look at the raw resources, right? And you look at what Borthwick is building, and I genuinely think he is trying to do something that is adaptable and can change, but also there is an effort in there to, you talk about everyone copying things. I think Borthwick is trying to do 2 fronts, right? One of which is he's trying to create processes that work every time. Right? So much of it is built on the kick chase because you can make that the same every time because it just comes down to the effort of one player, of the winger, running in a straight line. And they will always be fast, And if not, you can bring them off and bring on a new winger and that can work in their place. The scrum will broadly go the same every time. Like most scrummagers who are brilliant scrummagers remain so over the entire game. They might have one scrum where you slip off, but broadly from top, you stay on top. It's creating those processes and those tactical innovations and moments that you build a game around that work every time so you can repeat and build the rest of the game around them. It's like he's taken it's like using the 1-3-3-1 but for the entire tactic structure. You've got structural points you can just stick everything else onto. Because
that conserves and gets the best out of every single player.
Yeah, because you then look at it and you then build beyond that into the other half of it, which I think he's trying to do what the Springboks did, which is elements of the Springbok defence that Jacques Nienaber initially created, then Felix Jones twisted and adapted and then took to England before leaving, are adopted by everyone. The catch-up defender, the adjusting defender, that you having a back rower pelt it across to cover the width of the field, people drifting off, a lot of that has been taken on by everyone. However, there are other elements that can't. And what I think Borthwick is looking to do is he's gone, okay, we are the only other team in the world that have the raw resources to run the Springbok defence. Literally England and South Africa, the only two players that have the players to do it. There are other countries which could probably put out a pack who could run it for 50 minutes, but do they then have 2 packs that can come on and replace that? Do you have the depth to bring on a complete second pack who can run that defence? Do you have someone like Ibn Etzebeth or Mario Toje who can be the leader of that? Do you have someone like Tom Curry who can act in that Peter Toy role of flying out a line and being incredibly aggressive and not necessarily always making a tackle, but always putting pressure on?
And also not just one player like Tom Curry or Peter Toy. You need to have 2 or 3 players like that, in a matchday squad.
Which thankfully he's got an identical twin.
Yes.
So that really helps.
Yeah.
But I think what Borthwick's then doing is trying to build something around England's strengths. And he's gone, well, actually, a lot of our strengths are similar to South Africa's, and adapt it from there. And I think the interesting thing was Felix Jones left too soon, because really they probably would have been fine if he'd left a year down the line, a year further along, because what they were starting to do was adapt. Like that first Six Nations, it was largely he came in and he went, here's a South African defence. You know, we're going to run the same system, we're going to run this idea. And then by the end of that system, by the end of that tournament rather, they had started to tweak and adjust it to be their own, right? And we're starting to see differences in the system. And hence why they were much better by the end of the tournament, because suddenly, instead of just being the kind of aggressive press blitz, South Africa broadly used that defence to feed their kicking game and their pack and their forwards, and feed their strengths. England were using it to feed an attacking game. And so we saw their attack go up massively against Ireland and France, because it was coming off the back of the pressure their attacking game was putting on, the defensive game was putting on rather. And then over the summer we saw that continue, and I thought they did a really good job over the summer defensively. And then it had to twist over the autumn, because Joel Abd came in and took over from Felix Jones. And I think it's clear, and I haven't gone back and watched, Coaching in the Pro Day, admittedly, and maybe I should do that before we go, for a later deep dive on this, but there have been twists, because that was not the system Joel Abd was running, right? And they went after a couple of defence coaches from South Africa, and they went after things there. But what Joel Abd has done is, the one change he's made that I think is really interesting is around the fullback's role, where the fullback is now coming up into line sooner, but they're hanging back, right? It's become like a very popular defensive trend to have the fullback come up into line early and the blindside winger pendulum round sooner, and you just kind of like use the fullback as like a pressing, as a blitzing option. And that was part of what England were doing. There's a lot of other defences that run that are more traditional kind of like push-off defences and so on. However, El Abd has adapted, so the fullback is now coming up and still waiting behind the line as kind of an additional defender rather than fully blitzing, because it's less risky.
Yeah.
But I think it's led to things such as the Mark Talea try, the second try, because forward holds off as in that fullback role, right? The 10 or 15 or whoever's blitzing up.
Both of those Mark Talea tries, in fact. The first one with Freeman having to bite in, knowing that there's not somebody on the outside just yet.
Yeah. So it becomes a massive issue there. I think England's biggest issue is that they aren't committing fully to defence. They've made a change to make it less aggressive, and what they need to be doing is making it more aggressive, because that is the thing that's working for them and the thing that's works best. Is that fullback role is a fascinating position, and that's the thing that, like, if I was an England fan, in that opening game, the thing I'd be looking for is the first time a team gets to the edge, what does the fullback do? What does Freddie Stewart do? Does he, or Marcus Smith it may end up being, does he absolutely pelt it out of line, past the line and try and make a smash tackle? Or does he wait slightly behind so he can adjust and drift off?
On the topic of what can they do better to make this hammer a better defence, right? So you talk about the Springbok system that Felix Jones originally kind of put onto England, that template. I would say probably one of the biggest differences between that Bok defence and the one that England were running, which is now being translated by Joel Abd, right, is the Dwayne Vermeulen role, which is somebody who lingers around the breakdown, doesn't move that much, but watches out for the entire defence, scans it. What sort of probably a fullback's role was in sort of 90s, noughties, then probably more became a nines role in defence when they were kind of more as the sweeper rather than like a third centre in the line is traditionally the nines role nowadays. That was Dwayne Vermeulen's role, right? Then when Dwayne Vermeulen became less of a frequent player in the Springbok team, they moved it on to Frans Malherbe because he's the least mobile member of that Springbok team. He could get to every breakdown, but he wasn't going to fly off the line and make a massive shot on a Marcus Smith or a Richie Mo'unga or a really agile fly off or inside centre, right? So the question, I guess, off the back of that is there a player in the England squad that you think could be that guy? Because at the moment, they're going for this hammer, they're going for it really aggressively, right? But sometimes you have to pick your moments to go softer and go for a bit of a drift instead. They've not got Dan Cole, who is the equivalent of a Frans Malherbe of just, an older player who has less gas in the legs, but was there for his scrummaging ability.
And you want Ben Earl flying out of line. You don't want him using that in that role. And equally, I think part of the problem was I didn't identify, and someone else may have picked up on this, this is where Connor from Wilbur Rugby would come in very handy. As far as I could spot, Ellis Genge run that role a bunch over the autumn, but then equally, he's an incredibly athletic prop. He's really good at getting off the line, so you want him doing that.
He's a huge hitter. He's great at the breakdown, and
So
he's a great carrier. So you need him in positions where you can anticipate any of those things. Potentially, it might be a case of sharing that between him, Will Stewart, and Jamie George as a front row unit, and just getting them to look up, scan, see absolutely everything as an old school fullback or nine would do. Because all of those are, you know, pretty good at the three things I just mentioned. But also, it's not like you're wasting one of them if one of them is doing it and you've got two more on their feet, you know?
Cowan, Dickey, Blamire, whoever comes in with George, you know,
of course,
the
Langdon.
Langdon, which would be interesting as well as a separate point. But
can we talk about front row then? Just very, very briefly. Because obviously there's no Dan Cole. We've got Asher Apoku-Forjaw has come into the squad, who is a hugely exciting talent. And I'm really interested in how they're going to manage that tight head role. That it's a big risk to put a lot onto a young sort of 20, 21-year-old, I believe, tight head from who isn't necessarily always starting for Sale. I think Sale are doing a really good job of managing him. And yet, England would be foolish to not check him out, you know? And Will Stewart's been very, very solid. But it's one of those interesting things with props. When a prop is solid and they're not destructive, you don't know how good you have it.
Yeah.
You know, you don't know whether to roll the dice.
And this was the thing, wasn't it? That Dan Cole has been the best scrummager in England for, 86 years?
Yeah.
You know? Since 2010 in his debut, like pretty much since then, he's been the best scrummaging prop available to England. And there's still a very strong argument he is at the minute.
Yeah.
And yet, I completely understand he is 35, 37, I think, maybe even. I completely understand why Borthwick has made the decision he has. And Apoku-Forjaw has been fantastic, and again, is someone whose ceiling is incredibly high. But the question is, we don't know if he's quite ready for the top level. Like, we saw Nicky Smith not too long ago go and like absolutely tear him inside out twice, once for Tigers, once for Ospreys. We've seen, a couple of other like season international props. Joe Marler did it last season, where you've seen like props that have been around the block a long time and have a good reputation in scrummages have been able to get at him a bit. And the Six Nations is too big a competition to be throwing him in the deep end. But,
he's going to have a hard time in his first 10 caps.
Yeah.
That's going to happen. It's
the thing Geffen Jenkins said, like, every prop has a tough time in your first 10 caps. Like, that's just the state of it.
Yeah.
And then you build from there, especially when he's 21 years old.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So, yeah, that's one of the really interesting areas of selection. The other one, of course, is fullback, where George Furbank is out injured. England was starting to, because their kicking game has adapted a lot in the last year. That's really, like, changed how they're kicking, but particularly how they're running a lot more ball back. And often it is they're running back one phase, maybe playing a second phase, and then kicking the ball rather than just like hoofing it immediately. But Furbank, and I think especially because like he put on a bit of weight, between off seasons, like before the World Cup.
Good weight, not bad weight.
Yeah. But like deliberately, and it gave him a bit of like bum foul when he ran the ball back.
Yeah.
From fullback, and it really added a lot to his game.
And it didn't take any of the distribution stuff that he brings over
pace
Freddie Stewart. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I think it added a lot to his game, like just as a counter-attack runner. And they've lost that now. Freddie Stewart's been playing really well, and he's really challenged himself to become a more attacking force.
And he's definitely doing the distribution thing more.
Yeah.
He's challenging himself in that regard.
Yeah, but you lose A second playmaker, and B, that force running it back at fullback. So that becomes interesting. There's a lot of talk of whether they move Marcus Smith to fullback and put Finn Smith in at 10. I think that's silly.
There's a huge negative in that Marcus Smith is no longer your 10, if that's happening.
Because Marcus Smith was unbelievable in the autumn, and because Finn Smith is so good at Premiership level, and I'm sure would be a great international 10 if we got to look at him.
Definitely.
But people are forgetting just how good Marcus Smith is and has been over the last few months.
They're both brilliant game managers, but also on top of that, I remember watching the Autumn Internationals, you'd hear Austin Healy on comms saying, like, just give the ball to Marcus Smith and see what he does. Yeah. And it sounds like a kind of like a football thing rather than a rugby thing, but also it's right.
Yeah.
Like, he does just have that in a really rare way for a rugby player, especially a fly half. Yeah. It's something you usually say about wingers, but he is just that brilliant. And I think that's his secondary thing now behind game management, which is also Finn Smith's primary thing. They're both so good at that.
I think at the minute, he is the second best 10 in the world to Roman Underback for me. And I think, I say that with enormously high praise because there's a lot of really good 10s out there at the minute. And I think some days he's number one. But yeah, I think, why would you not pick him? Why would you not pick him there? To just circle back a little bit to the defence.
Yes,
and
sorry.
No, absolutely no. It's fascinating to kind of look around this. The thing about the defence, right, and this comes back to the entire game plan and how Steve Borthwick is managing this team. And rather than looking at the defence itself, I think one of the interesting things to do is to look at the way that Steve Borthwick, in a very different way to Eddie Jones before him, and, even different to Stuart Lancaster before him, certainly Martin Johnson before him, is looking at English rugby as a kind of holistic approach in that very Razzie Erasmus style of having, as we talked about in a previous, one of these sat in these chairs, the Moby squad, and having all of that, and what Galtier's done with trying to unite the top 14 clubs and so on. What we're seeing with Borthwick, I think, is him try and bring English rugby closer together. And so, the thing that I think is really interesting is that defence, right? And that's controversial, some people are talking about it, and people are constantly bringing up, should England drop it, whatever. The clear signs are they are not going to. And the clear signs, if you want to look for them, are not in the England national rugby team. They're in England A and England under-20s, who both run the same defensive system. So the idea there being, with England A, they got to look at a separate 40 players over the 2 games they played in the autumn, who could come in and learn that system so they can be dropped in if they need it. They've learned that as a separate game plan. They've been given the notes. They've been given the feedback. They've worked with Joel Abbott a little bit to make sure they're running that system. And in the England under-20s also had in the summer, when they won the World Championship, running that defence, running that same system. So that and no doubt they'll be running it in the under-20s Six Nations that runs concurrently, right? That is the exciting
That's so
thing.
interesting.
That's like, clearly this is like part of Borthwick's thing, that similar to what they do with Ireland and South Africa, where they have the age grade sides are dropped down and Leinster play the same way as Ireland, and the under-20s play the same way
if your
as
senior
that.
team play 1-3-2-2, you want your juniors to learn what 1-3-2-2 looks like.
Exactly.
Even if you play different moves around it, you want them to know how that system works.
Exactly. So they've got that going with the lower England teams.
That's so interesting.
So that's a level of this that I think is
It's a long-term plan.
Yeah, it's a long-term project, and they want to join that up. And I reckon if we start looking for this more, deliberately, there is much more of this going on in English rugby than you'd expect. Like Connor of Wibble, pointed this out previously, that Borthwick put an emphasis on his 10s to kick drop goals. And suddenly we saw Harlequins kicking drop goals for the first time, maybe in their history. Like both Smith, Finn and Marcus, suddenly were kicking drop goals for Northampton and for Quins, which they weren't doing before that.
Yeah.
There's this big change because Borthwick wants drop goals to be a focus in his game plan.
Now George Ford is known as a drop goal expert, which he wasn't before.
Yeah. He wasn't 3 years ago, 2 years ago even. Yeah. Yeah. But there's clearly this attempt to join English rugby up. And I think Borthwick is an incredibly, incredibly smart guy.
Yeah.
I think he thinks about the game incredibly deeply.
He knows so much about the stats side of it, but also the emotional side of it. He's clearly got bang on.
Yeah.
From the day he started with the England squad. I've never seen an England team who talks so much about the emotion and what they'll do for each other.
Yeah. And that comes across. They play, and you made this point before during last year's Six Nations, but they play for each other in a way that very few England teams do in rugby, because traditionally England are the big brother who kind of comes along and beats everyone up and then leaves with their lunch money. And if that doesn't happen, then they look embarrassed and they kind of put their hands in their pocket and they go, "Oh no, oh dear me," and walk off.
And everyone criticised them for it in the World Cup when they were going no one expected us to do this well. Because obviously you kind of do when you base it on the RFU and stuff. But also everyone throughout the World Cup was going, well, England are shit.
Yeah.
And they weren't.
They lost to Fiji 3 weeks before that World Cup.
Exactly. They have a right to say that,
Yeah. So I think Borthwick is building a England team that and again, Connor of Wibble, not to keep mentioning him, but he made the comparison to the Clive Woodward team of 2001-ish, when they kind of started adding to the foundation they already had of a very good kicking team. They started adding a more aggressive defence, and particularly this lovely attack, with Brian Ashton coming in. And we're seeing the start of that in the Six Nations. It then seemed on pause over the autumn, which was interesting, and their attack seemed entirely around Marcus Smith. And I'm interested to see how they get back to that. But yeah, I think this England team, I can see them winning the Six Nations without a Grand Slam.
They could come anywhere from first to fifth, is the thing.
I also think it's entirely possible they end up fifth.
Yeah.
But
all last minute losses, which are losses nonetheless. That's not to negate from them.
Because I think the other side of this, right, is you look at the Australia game, you look at the Fiji game before the World Cup, and that England team had some really, really incredible performances in them, and they should have beaten the Springboks in that, or could have beaten the Springboks in that semi-final. They did beat Ireland. They easily could have beaten France and New Zealand 3 times, and yet they still had the Australia game, right? And they still had the Wales game where they barely scraped past the worst Welsh team in history.
Yeah.
And I can see that happening against Wales again this year, and would have been if it wasn't at Twickenham. If it was in Rome, then I think that could have been an issue.
Definitely.
I think this England team, their big challenge this year is to add consistency to what they've been doing already. as well as converting those little wins or converting those near misses into wins.
Yeah.
And I think Wales's best chance of winning the championship is the England game up last, because I think there's a good chance England go on a good run. They beat, maybe France and Twickenham. They, get the Calcutta Cup back, and then
they have nothing left.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or they kind of go like, well, we'll beat Wales easily, and then Wales are much better than they expect.
It's interesting. I've seen a lot of people complaining, saying like it's an uninspiring England squad. They need new young blood in there, and I just don't think that's the case, because they've got players who know how to compete at international level, and also throughout a tournament, you can change the players who are in positions.
Yeah.
You can drip feed
loves
people
naming
in.
a squad.
He does love naming a squad.
He'll name like 6 more before the nations begin.
Also, you can start with a team that looks like the one that played in the autumn, and then you can roll in someone like Joe we were on about earlier, someone like Tom Willis, who has been incredible in the Premiership. Is one of my favourite players to watch at the moment. Like, unbelievable both sides of the ball. That there are plenty of players who are knocking on that door who have succeeded at Premiership level and at European level, who will add something later on down the line into this squad.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a really exciting thing. So, how do you see England doing in this year's Six Nations?
I think they're going to do well. As I say, it could be anywhere from 1st to 5th. I'm going to go with my prediction. I reckon they'll finish 3rd. I want to say. So. Because I just think France and Ireland might be a bridge too far for them. But I think they'll be in those games, and then it'll be similar to France last year, where Ramos does something crazy in the last 3 minutes that wins them the game. And I think Ireland will just be too themselves to crack,
I think they'll go into the final game with it possible that they can win the championship, and they'll finish 3rd.
Yeah.
That's what I see coming. But easily, it could be that we get like 3 balls bounced differently, as almost happened last year, and they end up, winning the thing or falling just there. That France game is a really exciting one. That's the big one for me. Is I don't know how they're going to do there. I can see them pulling it off.
But once again, France will have Dupont and Tamac playing in that game, which changes it.
Yeah, the entire picture changes. But England will have Marcus Smith.
Yeah. And it's great going into a Six Nations where we've just named a load of players who are that kind of guy who can just completely change a game on their own.
Absolutely.
And when you put that many of them on a pitch together, there's no way of predicting what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So this whole thing's pointless.
So, Lawrence, anything else to add on England? Or do you want to go back to the brothel that we were in half an hour ago and spend 10 grand on drinks?
Well, even in character, I would feel weird answering that question on mic. So,
who's Mike?
He cost me 10 grand.